Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was on the roof of the station when the highway went quiet. The air had a dusty bite that told me another dry front was rolling in from the mesas, and the sky over the San Francisco peaks had the faint orange wash I'd only ever seen during bad fire seasons. Interstate 40 ran like a ribbon across the flats to the east of Flagstaff, and my station sat just off the shoulder where the old frontage road bent south and then died in the gravel. I'd worked here for 15 years. I knew the way the steel canopy creaked when the afternoon wind hit it, the way the underground storage tanks sounded when you thumped them with a boot heel, the rattling buzz of the soda cooler before the thermostat kicked the compressor on. I knew the smell of gasoline and diesel so well that I could tell when a fill cap wasn't seated from 20 feet away. And when the first emergency broadcast broke into the country station, I kept on the workbench radio. Viral pneumonia. Do not approach symptomatic individuals. Shelter in place. I switched the radio off and stood listening to the road. Within an hour, eastbound lanes were thick with cars. Families with mattresses tied to roofs, pickups towing trailers, little sedans with the trunk lid bungeed down over plastic storage bins. It looked like wildfire evac, but bigger. A whole region boiling east. No one stopped for gas. Some slowed, rolled, looked toward the forecourt like they might swing off, then thought better of it when they saw what the westbound lanes looked like. Sirens, hazard blinkers, fender to bumper, more cars trying to go back the way they came than forward. I climbed down the ladder, locked the roof hatch I'd improvised years ago, and walked through the store with the lights off, out the back door, across the fenced service yard to the two-bay garage. The steel doors were already down. I pulled the man door closed and threw the bolt. By noon, the cell network collapsed into SOS only. By 2, the last television signal carried a shaky feed from Phoenix. A camera panning over a line of uniformed personnel outside a hospital, then breaking up into square blocks of frozen color. I shut everything down but the small radio I kept on a battery bank and turned that to AM. I heard National Weather Service frequencies repurposed for emergency bulletins, and a calm voice reading out county names and instructions that got shorter as the hours passed. Avoid contact, remain inside, conserve power. By dusk, the horizon over the city glowed so steadily it looked like dawn in the wrong direction. I'd stayed for wildfires when closures were only a mile away, and for winter storms when the plows had given up on the frontage road. People wanted receipts to send to their companies and a mechanic willing to crawl under a 30-foot box truck on frozen concrete. I'd always been that mechanic. I told myself this would pass. I had inventory to protect and tanks full after a delivery the week prior. One 10,000-gallon UST for regular unleaded, one 7,500-gallon diesel tank. I had a small diesel generator in the back that drank less than half a gallon an hour at half load. I had a shelf full of filters and a pallet of bottled water with a November sell-by date. I had keys to everything and a welder that would run off the generator if I needed it. That night, I locked the gates across both driveway entrances and hung a closed power outage sign on the glass. The next morning, a military convoy blew past in the right lane at freeway speed. 6 trucks with tan paint and black tires, 2 marked ambulances, an unmarked SUV between them, and a flatbed with cases strapped down and a tarp tugging loose. No sirens, no lights. They didn't slow when a man waved from the shoulder with a cardboard sign that said water. I watched from the dark store, the air-cooling ceiling fan still for the first time since the station opened. I told myself it was logistics, moving east to a staging area. I told myself that in 2 days, crews would be patrolling. traffic would calm, and I'd reopen to the handful of travelers still able to pay with cash. I told myself not to stare at the orange wash over the peaks. By afternoon of the second day, the first ones wandered into the lot. They weren't fast. They weren't dramatic. A woman stepped through the tumbleweeds at the edge of the fence line, shoes gray with dust, eyes unfocused like she was looking just over my shoulder. She tapped her knuckles on the glass as if she were asking to borrow a phone. When I didn't move, she turned, put the flat of her hand against the glass, and pushed. When the glass didn't move, she slid along the wall, fingers searching for a seam or a handle that wasn't there. Her knuckles smeared something on the glass that dried brown under the next hour's sun. She kept drifting until she hit the corner. Then she pivoted in a slow, stiff angle and kept going along the side wall until she reached the service bay roll-up. She pressed her hand there and kept it there until the sun went down and the wind picked up, and finally, a rusted yard sign came loose and clanged across the concrete near her feet. She made a sound then, a short rasp, turned toward the sound, and wobbled in its direction until she met the fence. She didn't fall. She leaned with her shoulder into the chain link and tried to push through. When the emergency broadcast mentioned infected, it was just a word. Seeing it in front of you is different than hearing it. The third day brought a man in a button-down shirt with a tie half off his neck and both shoes on the wrong feet. He walked into the barrier gate across the driveway and kept walking into it until the gate moved an inch, then 3, then started to sway back to closed. He found resistance and pushed harder. He was breathing. He was warm. He was wrong in a way my eyes refused to make sense of until I made myself stare at him for long enough to admit that he wasn't blinking and he didn't seem to be there in the middle of his own face. I decided that afternoon that this wasn't going to be 3 or 4 days of inconvenience. I decided I was going to turn the station into a place that could hold. I started with steel. The station had 2 bays, each with a roll-up and a tall pane of safety glass beside it that separated the bay from the store. When the sun was overhead, that glass lit the whole room. Now, it was a liability. I dug out 24 angle irons from a pile of old service rack legs, measured span lengths with a tape, and cut lengths to match the window width. I pulled sheets of 14-gauge steel from behind the compressor housing and welded frames for each pane, then lag-bolted the frames to the concrete block on either side of the glass. The sparks lit up dust motes. The smell of flux stung my nose the way it always did. I used the diesel generator to run the 240-volt inverter welder and watched the load stay under 3 kilowatts on the meter. Between runs, I listened with the power off to the way the station sounded now. Wind across the canopy, something light skittering in the forecourt. A steady tap on glass where one of them found a reflection and wanted to understand it. I cut plate to cover the side windows and seam welded it to the frames. I set heavy plates over the rear door and drilled for carriage bolts on the inside so you couldn't unbolt it from outside without grinding the heads off. I caged the rooftop ladder with mesh and drilled padlock hasps into the ladder's bottom 6 feet. The front doors got an interior ram's bar made from rectangular tube steel that dropped into brackets anchored by epoxy to the floor. The man door off the service yard got the same. I took the keys off my belt and hung them on a pegboard hook, boiled a kettle on a camp stove for bad coffee, and took inventory by headlamp. Underground storage tank status showed on the Veeder route console. I'd shut the submersible pump circuits at the breakers on day 1. The console beeped a low-power alarm. The 10,000-gallon unleaded tank read 9,290 gallons. The diesel tank, 7,300. Volume changes day to night told me the temperature was still swinging. No water alarms. Tank bottom float readings looked clean. I pulled a sample from the diesel's low-point sump with a squeeze bulb and a clear jar. No water at the bottom of the jar after 10 minutes. I labeled the jar Diesel UST and put it on the shelf. Then I walked through dry storage. 2 pallets water, 40 cases each, 24 half-liters per case. That's 1,920 half-liter bottles, 960 liters. Conservatively, if I set 2 liters per day for one person, that was a year and 3 months. Add the flat I kept in my trailer and the stash behind the office couch, call it 1,010 liters. I had canned goods I'd built up over the years on the "it might snow" principle. Beans, corn, tuna, fruit, soup. I had trash bags, duct tape, nitrile gloves, shop rags. I had 4 cases of oil, 6 fuel filters for trucks, and 2 spare air filters for my own pickup. I had a fire cabinet with 2 ABC extinguishers and a CO2 unit. I had a first aid kit I'd built from the firefighter discount catalog, with trauma dressings, nitrile gloves, antiseptic, and a blood pressure cuff. I had a sleeping bag in the office and a cot in the service bay loft. With the shutter plates welded and the man doors barred, I went outside with the generator shut down and walked to the forecourt. The pumps had narrow steel skins that came off with a security bit. Inside each was a steel column, wiring, and hose valves. I removed the nozzle assemblies and sealed the hoses with plugs, coiling them and zip-tying them at full height into the columns so I could reattach later without trying to lift a cold-soaked hose. I filled the pump cabinets with sandbags from the service yard flood kit and bolted the covers back on. Each pump was on a steel base anchored to the concrete. A car could bump one, but it couldn't dislodge a base without a chain and a tow point. I moved worn-out tires into rows, slid them around the pumps, and filled gaps with more sandbags. It wasn't pretty, but it broke up the long straight sight lines and created something like a wall you'd have to weave through. I welded rebar spikes into horseshoe-shaped brackets and drilled expansion anchors into the concrete so the brackets couldn't be pulled free with a rotary hammer. The spikes sat angled outward at shin height. I made note to run caution tape around them later. I wanted to slow any vehicle and stop any person who came over the fence. I did not want to injure someone who truly needed help, so I left the south driveway gate clear, closed, and chained. I hung a sign with big letters, "Inside, knock twice, pause, then once." The third night, I went on the roof with a spare LED floodlight and 2 panels salvaged from a roadside advertising trailer. Those trailers had 4 hinged panels, about 100 watts each, with MC4 connectors and a little charge controller locked under a lid. I took 2 of those panels the day before, along with the controller. I mounted them with unistrut on the roof's south edge, wired them in parallel to keep the voltage under the controller's limit, and ran 10-gauge down conduit to the loft where I had a pair of deep-cycle batteries I'd used for jumper packs. It wasn't much, 200 watts, 2 batteries at around 100 amp-hours each, but it would float charge the batteries and give me a little light at night without starting the generator. Later, if the roads opened, I told myself I'd pull more panels. I'd seen the big billboard 3 miles west with a 16-panel array behind it that fed a commercial inverter. If I could get those modules and a proper MPPT controller, I could run lights and the radio around the clock without making a sound. I kept the floodlights off the first nights. The first ones who came into the lot moved toward the sound of my boots on concrete, toward the rattle of chain when I opened or closed a gate, toward the scrape of steel when I slid a plate in place. They worked at barriers quietly until a sound pulled them a few feet to the side, then worked there. It was like watching a magnet drag iron filings around the floor, each one moving alone, but all of them taking the same curve at the same time. I turned light on once to see how they reacted. The beam hit a half-dozen figures near the south gate, and all of them turned their heads toward the brightness like moths do, not moving their feet until the light moved to the left. Then they stepped where the light had gone. I shut the lamp off and crouched in the dark until they forgot the light and went back to the gate. I wrote it all down. I took one of the grease-stained spiral notebooks from under the counter and turned it to a fresh page. Day 1, broadcast. Traffic east heavy. Tanks at 9,290 gal. Power down, generator idle. Then Day 2, convoy eastbound. Forecast wind shift. Phoenix glow persistent. And Day 3, first infected on lot. Behavior, sound and light responsive, slow approach, persistent pressure against barriers, no tool use observed. I wrote times down to the minute and used the solar calculator watch on my wrist to check day length. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it. Part of me did it to get through the hours between dusk and dawn. On the morning of Day 5, 4 living people came to the gate. 2 truckers, one with a beard down to his chest and a baseball cap turned backward, the other with a shaved head and a neon safety vest. A young woman with a pinned-back ponytail carrying a duffel bag. A boy about 15 wearing a hiking backpack with a t-shirt tied around his nose and mouth. They stood 10 feet back from the south gate with their palms up where I could see. The bearded one called out, "We need fuel. We can pay cash." His voice carried in the still air. Behind them, the highway had stalled into long pauses between waves of cars. The waves sounded like the sea, a sound the desert shouldn't have. I went to the gate and put both hands on it. "You alone?" I said. "4 of us," he said. He gestured to the woman and the boy. "Her car died. We were convoying. It died and then it wouldn't start." He pointed toward the road. "There were some of them by the underpass. We pulled off and came this way." "Armed?" I said. The shaved head lifted his hands higher. "We got a tire iron," he said. "That's it." "No one behind you," I said. "No one in the weeds?" They all turned. The woman said, "Please, we just need enough to get to Winslow. They're saying there's a checkpoint there." I looked at their faces and the way they held themselves, and the way their eyes moved when I said armed. I saw the boy's left boot was untied and he hadn't noticed. The bearded one stood with his weight back on his heels, ready to move, but his hands didn't shake. The shaved head's knuckles were red like he'd been gripping a steering wheel for 6 hours straight. I made a decision I would argue with myself about for days and swung the gate open inward 6 inches. "Inside," I said. "Fast." They came through at a quick walk. I pointed to the shop door. "Inside there," I said. "Keep your voices down." They went in. I swung the gate closed and set the chain back through the latch. I watched the shoulder of the freeway until my eyes watered and then went inside and closed the steel door behind me. In the store, I kept the lights off and turned a small battery lantern to its lowest setting. The woman's name was Danny. The boy was her son, Lucas. They'd left Holbrook the day before when the station at the exit ran dry. The 2 truckers were hauling empty flatbeds back from Gallup when dispatch told them to pull over and wait for further instructions. Then dispatch went quiet. They were named Saul and Eddie. They had cash. They had a plan that began and ended with fuel. "You can't pump," I said. "The submersibles are shut down, and I'm not starting the genset for that. You can gravity feed from my transfer tank into cans, and you can pour that into your tank. That's the deal." "Man," Saul said, "we used to fill here twice a week. We know you got a lake in the ground." "I've got a station to keep standing," I said. "If I turn on the pump, the canopy lights will come on and you saw what's outside. Fill cans, pour, and go. There is no negotiation." I kept my voice level. I didn't put any weight on the last sentence. I looked from face to face. Lucas watched me like a student who knows there's a quiz and is trying to guess the questions. "Fine," Eddie said. "Cans." I took them through the man door to the service yard, where I kept 2 30-gallon steel transfer tanks on rolling dollies. I'd built them from scratch for farm customers who wanted to fill their tractors without trying to line up perfectly at the pump. I had hand pumps on them. cast iron bodies with NPT threads and long steel handles that drew fuel up with a clack of internal check valves. "Those are diesel," I said, pointing to the green-handled one. "That's gas." I pointed to the red handle. "If you put diesel in a gas tank, you'll get 300 yards and stop. If you put gas in a diesel truck, you'll do a lot worse. Pay attention." I rolled out 2 5-gallon safety cans and handed one to each trucker. I looked to Danny. "What were you driving?" "Civic," she said. "Old, silver?" "Gas," I said. "Okay." I handed her a can. I turned to Lucas. "Stay with your mom," I said. He nodded and held the duffel. We filled cans. I kept my ears on the fence line and my eyes on the sky, looking for dust off the shoulders. The hand pump clacked and sang, diesel in one, gas in the other, until we had 20 gallons drawn. "That's it," I said. "Pour and go." Eddie grunted in frustration and looked toward the store. "We can leave you some cash," he said. "We'll pay you double later." "You can leave me your promise. You'll come back when it's safe," I said. "That's worth more to me than cash." "Safe?" Saul said, almost laughing. "When's that?" "Later," I said. "Go." On the forecourt, I moved with them, carrying 2 cans at a time and holding them while they poured into a funnel without spilling. I kept my voice down and told them to keep theirs down. The sun was high and the shadows short, and the wind had laid down to nothing. 3 of the slow ones had collected at the gate while we were inside, and more shapes were wandering through the heat shimmer down near the shoulder. Danny and Lucas poured into a 2-door sedan with a trunk full of boxes. I looked at the tape over the rear window with a question on my face, and she said, "Someone threw a rock in Winslow." I didn't ask anything else. When their tanks were up to a quarter, I told them to stop. "You'll get to Winslow," I said. "Drive steady, don't stop again." I pulled the gate enough to let the sedan nose out and wave them through. I told them to keep their windows up and to drive. Danny met my eyes and held them for a heartbeat. "Thank you," she said. Lucas lifted his hand and then dropped it like he was embarrassed by himself and turned away. They eased onto the frontage road, turned right, and merged onto the freeway shoulder. They made the quarter-mile to the on-ramp and were gone, swallowed by the eastbound traffic like a log in a river. The truckers stayed. "We want more," Eddie said, when I started to slide the gate closed for the last time. "You got it. We can pay. We'll be 2 minutes." "You got enough," I said. "I'm not spilling more gas on the ground and I'm not running the hand pumps with a line at my gate." "This is robbery," he said. "This is me, still letting you drive away with 20 gallons you didn't have," I said. "Man," Saul said, "we got families. And I have a place to defend," I said. "If you want a place like this when your road runs out, you don't make me choose between you and the next 4 who show up right behind you." I closed the gate and clicked the chain. "Take your truck," I said. "Go east." Eddie stared at me through the bars of the chain link. His jaw worked. He stepped closer. "We could take the pump," he said, voice low now. "Open the panel and throw the breaker. We know how to get fuel out of one of these when there's a fire season closure. We could do it fast, he and I together." "It would light the canopy lights," I said. "It would start the console and draw attention you can't bring with you and I can't turn off. Then you still won't get the fuel because the submersibles are on a lockout and I have the key. You don't get anything by making noise here. You get me killed later by what that noise brings." Saul looked at Eddie. Eddie looked at the fence. He said nothing. He took up the spare can and set it in the bed of his truck. He got in. Saul got in. They drove away without waving. That night, they came back. I heard them in the yard through the steel plates around 2 in the morning. Too much whispering. The scrape of a heavy boot toe on concrete. A small metallic sound right up against the door I'd barred with the rectangular tube steel. They'd gone around to the garageman door. I lay on the office floor with my hand on the buttstock of the lever-action rifle my father had given me when I turned 18 and listened. The lantern was off. The night outside was windless. I could hear my own breath. I could hear the difference between a chain pulled through links and a padlock turned in a hasp. "I got it," someone whispered. We pull now." Then the door shook hard, once, twice, 3 times, and the bar did what it was meant to do. The door flexed and sang, and then, after a short pause, the wrong sound. A distant answer. Not right at the door, but in the yard, and outside the gate, and beyond the fence. When one of them let go of the door and swore in a breath, the sound it made seemed to light a match out along the highway shoulder. I pictured the slow ones turning their heads toward it, lifting their hands toward the fence and starting to walk. "Stop," someone whispered. "We'll bring them." The footsteps retreated and then stopped. "Open it," Eddie hissed. We get in, we lock it again. We wait them out. He caves. "I heard you," I said from behind the door. "Walk away." Silence. Then the shuffle of action you don't plan but do anyway. Then another hit, then another. The door would hold. It was rated. The anchors were set in epoxy and tied into the block, but the noise would build outside, and the yard would be full of bodies by dawn. I counted 4 deep breaths toward calm, and then I made another decision I'd replay in my head afterward. I pulled the halyard knot on the bell I'd hung in the forecourt and let it clang once. I heard the sound reach out, wrap around the canopy columns, come back to me. I heard the shuffling outside the gate pick up into a scrape and a rasp. I heard someone curse on the other side of my door, then the small jingle of car keys and the small beep of a truck unlocking and the faster sound of 2 men getting into a cab. They didn't make it out of the frontage road without being forced to stop. I know because I was on the roof with my lantern off, watching by moonlight and hearing by memory the way an engine sounds when you let out of the throttle and then put your foot down again and there's nothing there because there are 3 shapes in the road in front of you and 2 to the right, and a line of them coming from the left. I didn't see what happened next. I heard metal on metal, a horn, and then the kind of stillness that only comes after noise you felt in your bones. From that night on, I didn't sleep long. Days blurred and slid. I did rounds at dawn and at dusk and wrote everything down. I burned what food waste I made in a barrel out back to keep the place from smelling interesting. I shut the toilet water angle stops and used buckets in the garage with a bag and bucket setup and a tight lid. I marked my water use on a notepad. 1.5 liters for drinking, 0.5 liters for cooking, 0.5 liters for washing hands and face with a splash of bleach to keep the pump spray bottle honest. I started the generator for an hour in the mornings to charge tool batteries and run the welder if I had a project. I turned it off and listened. I kept a police scanner on the shelf behind the counter with a small whip antenna pressed to the glass of the south window. During the day, I heard nothing but old static and empty repeater IDs every half hour. At night, sometimes a voice would push through. The first time I caught it, it was 3 words. Fort Leonard, survivors. Then a tone, then nothing. Another night it was fuel depots. Point of contact unknown. Then a string of numbers that sounded like lat long but didn't fit any map grid I knew. I stopped sleeping and started studying the scanner at the top of the hour and the bottom. During the times when dispatchers typically did roll calls, I thought I might catch a pattern. When the monsoon build would have come in a normal year, late July clouds over the rim and the daily rumble, the sky stayed cruelly clean. A storm did come the 3rd week, a squall line marching west to east with lightning dragging chains across the whole southern sky. I was on the roof at dusk to secure a ladder rung I'd added when the first flash lit the entire valley. For the fraction of a second that followed, the darker shapes out on the highway went stark. Every one of them stood still. Every reflection on the parked car glass turned white. Then the thunder rolled so loud I felt it in the soles of my feet, and the horizon flickered again. I had the impression of a column of figures moving along the shoulder where cars had been left, steady, in a line that ran beyond my sight. The storm blew through and left the air fresher and the night blacker than I had seen it in weeks. For 20 minutes there were no sounds at the fence. A day later, the mother and son returned. I heard a light knock at the rear door near noon. 2 taps, pause, 1 tap. The pattern I'd painted on the sign. I checked the camera I'd rigged, an old dash cam on a broomstick handle, wired to a battery pack. The fisheye lens showed Danny's face so close to the door that her breath fogged the plate steel. I cracked the door and let them in. Their sedan had died 12 miles past Winslow. The checkpoint never existed. The rumor had spread from one driver to the next and become fact through repetition. When the car stalled, they had taken food, water, and the duffel, and walked to the fence lines and drainage ditches all the way back to the exit where my frontage road began. They had seen no living people. They had seen 2 cars burning and 3 sitting with open doors. Lucas had a scrape on his knee and they had each drunk half a liter more water than their plan allowed because the sun was too bright and the asphalt was too hot. I made them sit in the dark office while I listened to the yard and then brought them water and a packet of cookies. I erased the chalkboard schedule I used for oil changes and wrote Daniela and Lucas above the counter, where customers used to write their names when the coffee club jar was out. I can't keep more than a few of us safe here, I said, but you can stay until you want to try for the next place east. Days, she said, without looking at the boy. We'll stay days, then we'll go at night. You'll go with a map, I said. You'll take the north frontage road as far as you can and you'll cut through the ranch road near the cell tower because there's a windmill there that might still be turning and a stock tank that will have water if the ranchers filled it before they left. If the windmill's not pumping, the tank may still have water, but it may be stale. Boil it. We don't have a stove, Lucas said. You do now, I said. And I put the small camp stove and a cylinder of fuel into a box with a handled knife and a tin cup and a lighter. They helped me for the next 3 days. We tightened the plate bolts and moved more sandbags and set up a sleeping corner in the service bay loft with 2 pallets, a foam pad, and a wool blanket. Danny sorted the food by expiration on the metal shelves and made a list with counts so we could track use, and she wrote it in neat block letters I could read by lantern light without squinting. Lucas cleaned the bay bays with a broom and then wiped the counters in the store. He peeked at the radio and I showed him how to tune to AM emergency frequencies and NOAA weather band. At 162.55 megahertz, he found a repeating robotic voice that read out an emergency instruction every 10 minutes. The message had been recorded weeks ago and triggered by some person somewhere who had a list of steps to follow when the phone rang. That person had done their job and then gone somewhere I didn't want to think about. I turned the volume down and thanked the voice anyway in my head. The 4th day after they came back, I heard a brief conversation on the police scanner around 3 in the morning. 2 voices. One sounded muffled and distant, like someone in a basement. The other sounded hot and close to the microphone. The close voice said, "We hold until morning and then we move with the fuel. Repeat, fuel inventory is primary." The far voice said something I couldn't make out, and then clear, "Fort Leonard." Then static and then silence. I wrote it in the notebook and underlined it twice. I didn't know if it was a fort in Missouri or a person's name. I started listening at the top and bottom of every hour again, like it would become a sequence and then a plan, if only I listened right. Danny decided to leave on the 5th morning. We loaded the pickup I had tuned back into life with 8 gallons of unleaded, 4 bottles of water, the stove, and a bag of food. It took me a long minute before I realized that the bag I was filling with food was mine, and that the food I was counting toward their supply wouldn't be here for me tomorrow. It felt like I held two truths at once, that of course I would say yes, and that I might regret saying it. I put 2 more cans into the bed. I handed Lucas the paper map with lines penciled onto ranch roads and the mark at the windmill. I showed him how to recognize the windmill by silhouette. A multi-blade head and a tall galvanized tower above a round steel tank. He nodded without smiling and folded the map carefully. I shook his hand and felt how hard he squeezed even though his palm was slick. I did not say anything that would sound like I needed it more than they did. I did not ask them to stay. I walked them to the rear gate where the infected visited less often, pushed the pickup into the yard with the engine off, opened the gate, and then told them to start it. They drove onto the gravel and pulled to the right without laying into the throttle. Danny leaned out the window once and held her hand up with her thumb out like she was hitchhiking and then drove on. I watched the empty road after they were gone, because watching an empty road lets you believe that maybe someone you help will come back down it. Instead of a car, a storm came in the late afternoon, one of those summer storms with a shelf cloud that looks like a line drawn by a ruler and stones of dust rolling out ahead of it. The first lightning hit somewhere south and the thunder came close behind. I went to the roof and secured the ladder and tied down anything that would blow. When the lightning hit again, it lit the highway shoulder like a photograph for a fraction of a second, and I saw a line of them. Not a mob, not a crowd, just a line of figures spaced out like fence posts walking in the same direction. When the thunder rolled, they stopped. I saw that too, because the next flash showed them in the same positions as the last. I went downstairs and sat with my back to the wall near the door, and I wasn't able to make the trick where you slow your breathing work until the storm had moved far east, and the only sound left was the rain gutter dripping. The generator failed on day 27 at 5:43 a.m. I wrote that down in the book before I did anything else because I knew I would need to remember the exact hour when I tried to make sense of it later. I heard the change before I saw the indicator go red. The low hum that filled the garage when the genset ran cut off like a string pulled tight and then snipped. The lights I had on for the morning check went dark. The scanner went silent. I stood still until I could hear again. Outside, the wind had dropped to nothing. I could hear the tiny ping of cooling metal from the exhaust. I checked fuel first. I had been logging runtime and adding diesel carefully. The little engine had enough to run at least 4 more hours at the current load. I checked oil. Fine. I checked the automatic voltage regulator for a loose connection. Fine. Then I saw the inlet fuel line, rubber hose, had collapsed under suction where it bent around a bracket because I had pulled the tank to service a fitting 2 days earlier and I had not rerouted the hose when I reinstalled it. It had taken 2 days to collapse. I stared at it for 3 long breaths that felt like failure. Then I cut out the collapsed section and replaced it with a section of hose of the right bend radius. I primed, I cranked, nothing. I cracked the injector line and cranked again. Fuel fogged the air at the fitting. I tightened, I tried again. The engine coughed and stayed dead. I told it I was sorry, and then I told myself I'd already burned the hours I could justify on a machine that had a cracked sound suppressor and a belt I'd been nursing along with a prayer and a spare I hadn't managed to find. Without the generator, sound discipline got easier. There wasn't any noise to discipline. Power got harder. I turned off everything in the station that wasn't essential. I moved the 2 billboard panels to steeper tilt and built a frame for 4 more panels I'd taken off the big billboard 3 miles west during a dawn run the week before. I mounted them low enough on the roof where I could reach to brush dust off with a broom from the ladder. I wired them in 2 parallel strings to a charge controller from an RV I'd found abandoned at the KOA, and tied that into a pair of lithium iron phosphate cells from the same RV. The readout showed 54% charge at noon and 83% by 3 in the afternoon. That would give me lights and a radio and a way to charge small batteries. I would not have power for the pump console, and without that, I could not legitimately, safely, or without waking up half the valley, pull fuel from the underground tanks, which left me with the transfer tanks and the hand pumps and whatever. I could gravity feed with a hose and a siphon from disconnected fittings at the fuel filter assembly. Noise started to carry differently once my ears learned the floor plan of quiet. I could tell whether someone was at the south gate or the west fence line from the way the chain link hummed. I could tell whether footsteps were on concrete or asphalt. I could tell whether a hand slid over glass or plate steel. I began to think of the place the way a firefighter thinks about a structure, not as a collection of parts, but as a set of paths sound can take and the ways people move through those paths. I drew those on a paper placemat with a pencil, and then drew them again bigger and then still bigger, until I could see how the bulk of the station itself could herd and slow whatever came. I set the last line of defense at the garage. I welded rebar into X-shaped stanchions, mounted them to base plates, and drilled anchors for them so I could drop them into place quickly. I put a row of steel stakes in the ground along the inside of the bay opening and capped them so they wouldn't hurt me if I fell. I rigged 2 propane cylinders to a short manifold with a manual shut-off valve I could reach from behind the stanchions. I ran a length of steel pipe along the floor to a shallow gutter I cut with a diamond wheel near the threshold. I set a pan of sand in that gutter that could be roughed with a splash of gasoline when I wanted a line of fire to keep shapes from pushing through. Not an explosion, just a burn that wouldn't rise high enough to set the canopy on fire, but that would teach anything moving toward the opening to go somewhere else. I filled a pail with water and set it under the shut-off valve because if you are going to call fire, you keep its opposite within hand's reach. I placed a second pail of sand beside it because sometimes the opposite you have is grit. 2 nights later, the pressure arrived. I woke to a soft thump that made no sense at first because I didn't feel it through the floor. It took me a long breath to realize it was a sound above my head. The roof. A person crossed the roof with feet placed carefully. Then by the ladder, a scraping faint enough that I might have made it up if the next sound hadn't followed. A hand on the ladder cage, fingers on mesh. A short breath that sounded surprised to find the ladder locked. That breath was the difference. The slow ones breathed, but they didn't let sound show surprise. It was someone alive atop my plate steel. I stood at the foot of the ladder and put my ear to the cage and listened to the small squeak that meant the padlock was being handled. Then came the smallest clink of an aluminum carabiner against a rung. I pictured a rope coming over the top of the ladder for someone to rappel with. Then a whisper I barely caught. Anchor. 2 of them, I decided. They were organized. They had the rope. They had not chosen my station by accident. I walked softly to the breaker panel and pulled the fire alarm I'd wired to a small horn under the canopy. It gave 1 short strobe flash across the forecourt, and then I cut it because I didn't need volume, only a change in the environment. The change did its work. The fence line to the south shifted with bodies. The forecourt was still for 2 beats, and then the softness of something more deliberate became loud in the way danger is loud in a quiet room. The sound of a person landing on a roof foot first and losing it into a sliding scramble. The mesh groaned. The padlock held. Then the whisper again. Hurry. They would not be the last people who thought to climb. I had built up, but I had not built for that. I put the bolt on the man door so hard the steel bar rang in the jam and stood with my back to the door, and counted breaths until the shuffle on the ladder quieted and then retreated. Whoever they were understood the math. More bodies across the yard meant fewer chances of a clean escape. The next morning, when the roof was clear and the fence line less pressed, I drilled 2 more holes and installed a second hasp and a second lock on the ladder cage. I ran a chain through the bottom rungs and set a lock there, too. I welded a steel shroud over the top of the cage so you couldn't get a pry bar on the hasp without a grinder. It didn't stop them from trying again from the forecourt the following night. A small group this time. 4, maybe 5 voices. None of them raising above a whisper. All of them holding exactly the wrong mix of desperation and patience. They had waited out the day in a culvert or a chuckwalla den or a truck cab and watched the yard for a pattern. They had noted when I walked the roof and when I didn't. One of them was patient enough to say to the others twice, "Not yet." When they finally moved, they moved toward the garage door and put a bar into the edge of the bay door where it met the concrete. They'd done it before. They knew the right angle and the right length of pipe for leverage. I knew what noise to make in return and when to make it. I took the ring of bolts from the rebar stanchions, rotated the fights tight, and then hit the steel with a hammer in the steady, even cadence that a slow, curious mind will follow. They stopped. The voice that had said "not yet" said "there," and whatever impatience was among them turned toward that sound, and then the other sound, the one outside the fence line that by midnight was never absent. A shuffling interest gathering at any change in the audio map of the place. I did not need to set aflame that night. I only needed to be more patient than someone already desperate. I might have managed 2 more weeks like that if the generator had not died the way it did, and if the scanner had not kept spilling words like fuel and Fort Leonard into my head when I needed sleep instead. Instead, I found more panels and bolted them. I rebalanced the battery bank into a 24-volt configuration to reduce losses, and moved loads to DC where I could. I built a small 24-volt floodlight from 4 LED work lamps and mounted it on a swivel so I could shine light straight down at the garage threshold when I needed to see without letting the beam wash out into the night. I pulled a length of coax cable from a ham's mast at a house near the frontage road and ran it to the office rafters, where I built a simple half-wave dipole cut for the FM broadcast band and the weather band. It improved my reception by just enough that the word Leonard stopped sounding like lay, nen, and more like Leonard, and the word depot sounded like depot instead of do. No other word around them cleared. I put the letters on the page anyway. The day after I rigged the dipole, late afternoon brought a different sound. Not the drag of shoes on concrete, not a foot sliding on the roof, an engine, and not a commercial truck, not a small sedan, something with knobby tires. The sound bounced off the canopy posts and arrived in the shop as a hum with a throat to it. Then it bumped up against the chained south gate and idled. I watched through the dash cam at the crack in the plate. A sport utility vehicle the color of dust, a cattle guard on the front, steel plate over the rear quarter windows, 2 people in front and 1 in the back. The woman in the passenger seat lifted a radio microphone and spoke without looking at the gate or me. I heard her on my scanner, her voice clear. "We're not here to hurt you. We're looking for people. Come out." And then a second voice from another radio somewhere farther off. "Sector clear." Then a third voice. "Hold until we clear the shoulder. Then move." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I couldn't have. The microphone was in my hand and my thumb was on the push to talk, and I couldn't press down with my thumb because the force it would have asked of me turned to water between my wrist and the button. Her truck circled and came back to the gate and turned off its engine. The silence roared. She leaned her head out the window. "We've got water," she said, now loud instead of through the radio, her voice moving through the gate like voice always had before. "If you're inside, we can help you go. We're not camping. We're moving this way, and your station is a problem for you if you stay." I leaned toward the microphone but did not press. My eyes burned. The urge to answer felt like a muscle spasm. "Show me your faces," I said into the mic without realizing I'd hit transmit until I heard my own voice on the scanner. The driver and the passenger turned their faces to the dashcam's small field. They did not take off their hats. They did not hold up identification. They did not show me hands empty of a weapon because each of them had 2 hands on the wheel and the dash and kept them there because they had been in enough roadside stops to know that certain hand motions turn situations. The backseat passenger leaned forward into the view, a young man with a shaved head. He smiled without showing teeth. He said nothing. "I can offer water," the woman said. "We can leave that for you and move on." She pointed to the back seat where plastic bottles lay in a crate. "If you need to go with us, we have space for 2. I pressed the button. "Where are you going?" "East," she said. "As far as we can before the highway becomes a parking lot again." "And then where?" I said, because I needed something that sounded like a plan, even if we both knew it was a direction. "Texas," she said. "People are saying there's a line down there where they're making a stand." "I don't know. I have to believe something." She paused. "You can't hold this place alone." She was right. I could not. But she wasn't thinking about what the station was to me. It wasn't a store. It wasn't a place to make money. It wasn't a set of services sold to travelers on a road that never stopped moving. It was a building I could predict. A map of sounds I could hold like a song I knew by memory. It was bolts tightened and a generator repaired and a pump console that would work again when this ended. I spoke into the mic, "Leave the water," and added, "Please." They set 2 cases inside the gate and drove away at 10 miles per hour, taking time to pick a path through the shapes that had begun to arrive at the edge of the lot like iron filings slow-drawn to a magnet. They did not go fast. They did not hit anyone. They made it out onto the shoulder, and then the freeway, and then the curve, and then they were gone. I waited an hour before I opened the gate enough to pull the cases inside with a piece of rope and a hook. I took each bottle out and set it on a shelf and wrote the new count on the paper beside the old count and wrote the date. After that, a week passed without living voices. The highway emptied for hours at a time. The scanner read like a machine left in a back room with a program to announce time once in a while. At night, the pressure built at the fence line like wind against a big door you hadn't realized was open, and every morning, when the light came up, the yard would be a little more scuffed and the gates a little more bowed. I adjusted stanchions and rebent brackets and replaced bolts and told myself it would snow this winter and quiet everything and make motion hard, as if snow would come this far south and this low in an Arizona desert square mile that knew more about dust than rain. I marked sunrise and sunset on the notebook page with a line so I could see the way fall was sneaking in. The final night began around an hour after dark with a silence that felt clean. I remember that because I stopped halfway up the ladder to the roof and thought, I could sleep tonight, in the same instant that my scalp prickled in the way it does when a thunderstorm is near. There was no thunder. The air smelled like cold metal and dust, the way the air under a bridge smells at night. I lay on the roof with my back against the small HVAC unit and watched the highway. When you watch long enough, you think you see motion where there is none. This wasn't that. This was motion. It began like a crowd at a concert when the band walks on stage, a small forward push that became a broad, slow press. The shapes moved toward a point the way water moves toward a low place. The point was my station. I felt the shift through the roof deck before I heard it. The press at the fence line didn't sound like a crowd. It sounded like fabric, like the scuff of sleeves against chain link. Then the chain link itself began to resonate the way it does on a windy day when the wind is steady. The gate shuddered. The chain went taut. The lock rings bit their hasp holes. The metal talked to me in a language I'd learned without wanting to. I rolled to the ladder, spun down, and ran my hand along the wall in the dark until I found the light switch I had wired to the 4 down-aimed work lamps at the garage threshold. I flipped it. The edge of the bay went a pure, hard white. The light stopped at the threshold because I'd caged the lamps. The press paused, but it didn't retreat. The line of shapes at the fence didn't turn away like the first ones had weeks ago. They leaned. Sound draws. Light draws. So does smell. I had never spilled enough fuel at one time to leave a big scent in the air. I had never left food out. Tonight, the smell that carried was dust and hot steel and the human inside of breath. It was enough. The south gate, the one I trusted, held. The west fence line bowed. I heard something I didn't want to hear, the improvisation of a crowd. A shape climbed another shape's back to find leverage. A third found a standing hump and used it to lever upward. The chain link groaned higher. The fence post bent. The corner post shimmied in its concrete socket. I walked to the bay threshold. I raised the lever action rifle and cycled it once and set it down behind the stanchions. I put one hand on the propane manifold valve and the other on the flare I'd taped to a dowel with 2 rubber bands. I told myself not to make a move I didn't need to make. The west fence went first. The post near the survey stake tore out of the ground with a noise that will wake me up in my sleep until the end of my life. The line didn't break like a wave. It crawled forward in a series of tripping, falling, rising motions, as the front rank had no room to step and the rank behind pressed. The forecourt filled not with a rush, but with a full feeling, the way a room fills with water from ankle to shin to knee. The shapes nearest the light turned their heads toward it. The shapes farther back kept pushing forward because the space beneath their feet vanished. The air smelled like old clothes and dust pounded out of carpet, and something that had once been sweet and was not sweet anymore. The first row reached the rebar stanchions and found the wrong lesson in them. The wrong lesson was climb. The right lesson would have been go around, but there was no around. The wrong lesson kept their weight high and unbalanced, and when the line pushed behind them, their bodies caught on the stanchions and made a jumbled barrier that passed energy through but did not pass bodies easily. A living crowd would have chosen a new path. This crowd did not choose. It only pressed. The stanchions sang. A wrist bone struck steel. A knee knocked a bolt head. The noise was enough to scatter a flock of birds. It didn't change anything here. I gave myself a count of 10. In that count, half a dozen shapes pushed chest-deep through the stanchion line, and their faces made a study in what focus becomes when it is not about thought, but about a hunger written into muscle. On 10, I opened the propane valve half a turn and lit the flare with my lighter and set the flare into the shallow sand-lined gutter. There was no explosion. There was whoosh, a low line of fire running 2 feet long and 3 inches high, dancing along the sand, licking at air, finding the thin film of gasoline I'd painted there and burning it clean. The light shift changed behaviors. Heads turned, arms reached. The front rank hesitated long enough for the second rank to push them, and then the third and fourth. And that weight lifted the first row into an angle that made the stanchions behave like an obstacle again instead of like a ladder. The flame, which was hot at the ankles and harmless at the knees, made the calculus under their feet different. They stepped back because the body steps away from heat, even without thought. Those who could not step back became ramps. The press behind slowed enough that I heard the chain at the south gate sing its own small thread of sound in a new key. The line did not break. It shifted. It found the narrowest place in my arrangement and decided, without deciding, that this was the new path. That place was the corner of the garage where the plate steel met the block wall, and I had left 2 inches of unguarded space between a stanchion and the door edge because I had needed a handhold for myself. Watching that space become the path hurt in a way I didn't know a place could hurt. I shoved a stanchion toward it with my shoulder and jammed the foot against the concrete. The crowd met the new geometry. It slowed, not because it wanted to slow, but because it had to. I reached for the rifle, not because I wanted to use it, but because a rifle is a plan when you have none. I set it aside again because the plan I had needed fire, not sound, and because I did not want to throw the wrong call into a night already about to tilt the wrong way. I turned the propane valve another quarter. The flame sounded deeper, as if a throat had joined the fire. The smell changed back toward metal. I braced my boots and pressed my back to a stanchion and watched the line find and lose balance, find it again, and lose it once more. The second shift happened the way a metal sign blows down in a gust that isn't stronger than the last, only longer. The west fence line outside gave easily once the corner post had torn, and now more shapes entered through the side yard. That flow bypassed the stanchions I had set for the front approach. It came sideways, up against the service bay man door, and then when the door showed no give, into the space between the man door and the blocked pickup I had welded to the floor weeks ago. A little space grew into a larger one, like a knot tightening through a loop. They found purchase there because I had given myself a handhold. 10 bodies through became 20. 20 became 30. The forecourt was no longer a room. It was a hallway, choked at one end. I had one thing left I hadn't yet done because I had hoped not to do it. I had set 2 propane cylinders, each with its valves closed. I had placed them into a sheet metal sleeve and run a line up to waist height. I had told myself that if the line pressed into the bay, I could open the valve and light a single torch flame at that line and keep the front edge from finding traction without letting heat climb. If the flame climbed, I could shut the valve. If the bottles heated, the pressure relief would pop with a whistle. I had a wet wool blanket ready. I set the rifle down. I reached to the valve. I turned it a fraction and thumbed the lighter. A small, steady blue cone sounded the way a camp stove sounds when you cook in the early morning. It lit the threshold evenly. The first 5 shapes who stepped into it stepped back. The 6th stepped and then didn't step back because the 7th and 8th and 9th behind it made stepping back impossible. Its legs locked, its center of gravity changed, it tipped sideways. That created a pile, and piles change everything. I closed the valve. The line forward fell into itself and did not rise fast because rising takes space. I stepped back into the garage and turned the lantern down without closing it because closing it would leave me in dark I was not ready to host. I pressed my back to the cinder block wall. I took 3 breaths, each with my hand on the rifle for a plan I still didn't want to use. Then I reached not for the rifle, but for the CB radio on the shelf. The one with paint worn off the microphone where thumbs over the years had pressed until plastic gave up its shine. I turned the volume until a low hiss filled the room. I tightened the antenna connector because tight gives the mind something to feel, and therefore to tell itself that it has influenced the world. I keyed the microphone. My voice once put through the Sunday morning commercials for windshield wipers now went into a night full of bodies that didn't listen and a sky that didn't care. If anyone can hear me, I said, this is the station at mile marker 207 east of Flagstaff. My name is Jack Mercer. I'm on the roof office of the forecourt garage. I have water and food for one for a little while more. I'm going to hold as long as I can. I stopped. I watched the threshold and the steady movement there that was a hydrostatic pressure given legs. I said, if there is a convoy in earshot, if there's anyone who remembers the red sign that said Mercer's, if there is a place south where people are stacking sandbags in the right order and can tell north from almost north, I'd like to know. I let go of the microphone and waited. The only answer was the hiss and the far, low sound of many feet moving, not in a run, but in an insistence. I pressed the button again and held it longer than I should have because holding it held something in me that had held everything here for weeks. "If there's a Fort Leonard," I said, "and if that means the place I think it might mean, and if you've got a fuel plan, you should know there's a lake of unleaded in the ground here and another of diesel. You'll need a quiet submersible pump and a tank truck whose valves open with a wrench and not a button. You'll need 2 people on watch and 1 on the hose, and someone who can pick a window to run and stop before the night shifts back against you. It can be done. It can be done quiet. If you know what you're doing, take it. You won't owe me anything. Just use it right. If I'm still here, beep twice on channel 19 and I'll cut the gate chain for you. If I'm not here, you'll know because the door will be open." I put the microphone down. I raised the rifle. I did not yet aim it at anything but the floor. The sound at the threshold increased by a notch, the way a crowd in a gym increases when someone opens a door to a hall. The plate steel I had welded along the side wall gave a small, repeated pop that told me where it would bend first. The stanchions stood where I had set them, and did their job the way steel does when you've picked the gauge right and sunk the anchors deep. I lied to myself once then and told myself the night would tire. I lied again and told myself morning light would thin the line. I lied a 3rd time and told myself that the scanner would crackle and the voice I'd been hearing would become a plan that had a place for a person inside it. The only thing that wasn't a lie was the radio on the shelf. The one I turned back on because I wanted to hear a human voice even if it was only my own memory talking back to me. The CB glowed orange like it had in the cabs of trucks that stopped here in monsoon storms, and in the early morning before the through traffic started. I set it at an angle where I could see it while I watched the threshold, and I did what I told myself I'd do. "This is Jack at the station," I said, holding the microphone with 2 hands because one hand would have shaken, "and I'm still here." Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.